Poverty is oppression. Good evening and welcome to our viewers. Thank you for joining us. I'm Yvonne Katsande. Well, today we'll take a look at issues affecting the ordinary African citizen, that is poverty and lack of good governance. Now, before we get into details of today's show, I will just read a bit on what exactly this means in case we have some of our viewers that might not really understand. Economy, which is defined as the wealth and resource of a region, can be grouped into two types, that is formal and informal. Capitalism and socialism are formal economies that differ based on the role of the government and equality of economics. Capitalism affords economic freedom, consumer choice, and economic growth. The arena of human rights discourse and practice has been dominated by attention to the more commonly known civil and political rights, rights to free expression, political and civic association, and freedom from torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. By contrast, economic and social cultural rights are much less well known, and only rarely do they form the subject concerted political action, media campaigns, or critical reportage. The widespread lack of basic human needs such as clean water, potable water, sufficient food, adequate shelter, and comprehensive health care, in sum, economic, social, and cultural human rights are the poor relation of the civil and political counterparts. Now, let's just quickly have a look at this short clip before we continue.
According to new data released by Stats SA, poverty is on the rise in South Africa. The latest report shows that despite the general decline in poverty between 2006 and 2011, poverty levels in South Africa rose in 2015. Africa's most industrialized economy has seen its economy in the last 5 years being driven by a combination of international and domestic factors such as low and weak economic growth, continuing high unemployment levels, lower commodity prices, higher consumer prices, lower investment levels, greater household dependency on credit, and policy uncertainty. The political situation in the country, which has seen President Jacob Zuma being the center of the alleged corruption scandals, has led to policy uncertainty, which in turn has led to a drop in investor confidence. Many analysts say that corruption of the current ANC government is largely to blame for the high levels of poverty in the country.
So joining me in studio this evening to take a closer analysis of what exactly is poverty and lack of good governance and how it affects the African citizen is in studio. That is Dr. Progress Palm Springs, a political analyst based here in South Africa. Good evening and thank you for joining us.
Good evening, Yvonne, and thank you for inviting me to this show.
You're most welcome. Now, the issue we're talking about here is not a new issue.
Definitely not a new issue.
Lack of good governance. Poverty is almost a daily reality that is witnessed, not only in Africa perhaps, but more rife in African countries. Now, is there acknowledgement by the African governments of the existence of poverty, and are there any attempts to actually address this poverty and lack of good governance?
Well, if we were to look at it averagely, averaging all the countries, African countries that we have, you would actually come to a conclusion that African governments don't actually acknowledge that there is poverty in reality. Why would I say so? It's mainly because the times that they come out and they actually acknowledge that there is poverty in Africa is times when they are actually forced either by media or they are forced by reports that have been done by independent bodies, for example, non-governmental organizations, or by their own people when they try to take them to task. And in their own sense, like autonomously as a government, they don't really do that. We only have like a few examples. You would look at Botswana, you would look at Rwanda, you would look at Tunisia.
Rwanda has done quite well from genocide to where they are now.
They have done quite well, and they try by all means possible to try and eradicate poverty. By that I mean having good governance, allowing for investors to come so that the economy, because remember in the opening statement you actually alluded to the fact that for a country to be doing well, for poverty to be eradicated, you need good governance, that's one, and then you also need an economy that is functional. So when you look at how the governments in Africa, in average, they don't really put that to
But what might be the cause of that? I mean, Africa is a country, a continent rather, that is rich in mineral resources, many mineral resources. We're talking about diamonds, we're talking about gold, platinum, name it. Africa has it. But the poverty situation has not really changed over the years. Still a larger percent of Africans live in poverty, dire poverty for that matter.
Well, the name of the show is Poverty is Oppression. The number one reason for poverty is actually from the mind, right? So if you have a leader who is depraved in terms of ideas, you are going to actually end up with poverty. If you had a people that are actually deprived of what they are supposed to give in terms of idea sharing and, you know, in terms of invention, they can actually contribute to the economy or to their own politics, you find out that you have poverty. So the short of it is, despite the fact that we have resources, despite the fact that we have labor, and we actually have a large population that is actually willing to actually give labor, organized labor for that matter, you will still find out that poverty is rife because we lack when it comes to the issue of propagating ideas that actually are meant to actually do away with poverty, for example. And I'm looking at examples like, for example, you mentioned minerals, you have GRC. The bulk of the country is actually suffering despite the fact that they have enough mineral resources for them to actually, you know, be taken out of poverty.
Alleviate the poverty situation.
So it's basically a function of what the people have in terms of the mind. And you know from the colonization that has happened before, and now we're trying to sort of like we're trying to redress the disadvantage that were actually brought by colonization. So that will take a long time. People are still being educated, but what kind of education? You need an education that is going to drive them to what the world has got. You look at examples of countries that have actually managed to do away or reduce the level of poverty. There are countries that have actually embraced, for example, the Industrial Revolution. We are far behind as the continent from getting to the Industrial Revolution. We are still doing primary and secondary production. So we need brains. Those brains are only going to be facilitated by good governance. They're also going to be facilitated by investors. If you have enough money plowed back into the society. And as you have noticed, African governments have never done so. In fact, they spend more on war than they do on any other...
Building the economy.
Yeah. We are talking also of infrastructure. You have less infrastructure. The infrastructure that is there is either the infrastructure that was left there by the colonial governments or the little that was done between you know, the former colonial governments trying to also inject something to the state.
And this is what they're actually still relying on, what the former colonial governments have put in place.
In most cases so. Yeah,
particularly in terms of infrastructure, just like you rightly put it. But even though the World Bank goal is to reduce extreme poverty, they have been at it for years to try and see how best they can assist African countries to reduce poverty by less than 3% globally, at least by the year 2030. Africa won't be able to meet that goal. Can you give us more background as to, even after you have really mentioned that it'll take a long time, I mean, it's been a long time already. 2030 is another 10, 12 years to come, and still 3% won't be achievable.
All right, let me give you an example before I dig into why Africa will not be able to actually meet this goal in the short time. Look at economies that have actually come on the fore. And this is irregardless of the governance, because you can look at the different polities that are there. For example, some people don't have presidents who are chosen. They have kingdoms, but the kingdoms are doing well. The reason why they've managed to actually achieve that is because
sorry, you said the kingdoms are doing well?
Yeah.
Which country has a kingdom that is performing well?
You look at the emirs from Dubai. They are doing very well, better than anybody else. And you don't choose anybody there. There are no elections for you to choose anybody. It's not necessarily an issue of, okay, your governance is supposed to be this type of government. It's actually a function of what you've put forward in terms of, okay, you want to do away with poverty, so we are starting from this direction. For example, if you have natural resources, you're supposed to actually buttress that on the natural resources. As you're selling them, then you are investing somewhere. Or you're also bringing in the expertise, the technology that is needed. When you look at Africa, the reason why we are solely going to be behind is because, number one, our embracing of technology is actually by a smaller margin, which is very problematic for the world that we are living, because now it has become a global world where whatever you're going to be doing as an economy or within your politics is going to be affected by what is happening in the global village. And then you also look at the level of education that we have. Many people are educated, but what kind of education they have? It's actually very... It's the kind of education that we have right now is what was very useful in the 90s. Do you understand? But we are in the 21st century.
It has not evolved to actually kind of incorporate the way it has.
And then we are also looking at, improving our infrastructure, because infrastructure is something that you really do need when you're going to actually address the issue of poverty. Our infrastructure is behind, and it would take us a number of years for us to actually attract people to help us with the infrastructure. So we're solely going to be behind because of our position. We are structured that way. And it's something that would actually need radical thinkers to actually help us to come out of that. It's like a virtual cycle that is going to be perpetuated for a number of years before.
Now, I like what you said there earlier on. You say that if you take a look at the countries that are being ruled by, people that have like kingdoms.
Yeah.
A good example, the UAE. And then we talk about Africa, where we have countries that have democracy. They actually go to vote for leaders who eventually refuse to cede power anyway. It's a common feature with most African leaders. They refuse to cede power. Now, my question would be, would you say that democracy actually supports the alleviation of poverty?
Actually, it can be actually singled out as one of the factors that can help in alleviating poverty. Why? In cases where democracy has actually been perpetuated in the right way and has been accepted by every party, you will find out that they have done better. Why? Because the interplay between economics and politics, the investors will only be able to actually put their money where they can trust the leadership and where they can trust the stability that is there. No one would like to invest where there is war. No one would like to invest where there is instability. So if democracy is actually perpetuated the right way, you'll find out that the economy can actually do well and poverty can be eradicated. But it's not always the case. Why? Because we have certain cases where some countries, like as I mentioned, they are not even democratic. They are far away from that system. Because remember, democracy is just a system of governance. You can have another system of governance that works. For example, China, they are not a democratic country. With their communism, they've managed to actually do very well. Why? Because they prioritize on the requirements that they need as China.
Are they a socialist or capitalist economy?
Well, today, as it stands, they are not really a communist economy as they used to say before. Because you find out Hong Kong, which is not very much so having the qualities of mainland China, is doing better. And China on its own is also trying to release certain freedoms within the economy to accommodate the growth that they need. So it's essentially about how you interplay what we have. For example, if the people need to actually have housing, accommodation, and you're going to do it through the economy side of things, then you have to actually have the freedoms that require that are required for the economy to actually do well. And then if the politics that is there will actually facilitate for you to actually do away with poverty or to reduce poverty, you find out that it's good for you.
Okay, now before I delve into my next question, we're just going to take a quick break. Viewers, stay with us as we continue with our conversation, Poverty is Oppression. Welcome back and thank you for staying with us. We're still talking about poverty is oppression. But before we continue with our conversation, let's just have a look at this clip and see how the economy of Sudan is performing.
Sudan is one of many African countries that have seen high levels of poverty. It has been beset by conflict for most of its independent history. Under the terms of a peace agreement in 2005, its southern states seceded, forming the Republic of South Sudan in 2011. Since the split, the overall economic growth in Sudan has not been translated into equivalent human development improvements and poverty reduction realities.
The situation is bad. It is a dire situation. We've talked to mothers. A lot of them are skipping meals, cutting down on rations, eating wild foods. So access to food is the biggest problem. Access to health also contributes to the nutrition situation, the sanitation situation. So it's a broad spectrum of access services that are contributing to the nutrition situation.
The cessation of South Sudan induced multiple economic shocks. The most important and immediate was the loss of the oil revenue that accounted for over half of Sudan's government revenue and 95% of its exports. This has left huge challenges as well as much reduced economic growth and resulted in double-digit consumer price inflation, which together with increased fuel prices, significant disparities between urban and rural areas are apparent, contributing to an increasingly urban informal sector which accounts for more than 60% of Sudan's GDP. Investments and services are concentrated in and around Khartoum State. This has encouraged a rural-urban migration that weakens the agricultural productivity and deepens poverty in both urban and rural areas.
Okay, now, Dr. Progress, what are the key opportunities, or rather key areas of opportunity to capitalize on African development?
Well, there are quite plenty in reality. You know, we spoke earlier in the first segment about the vast resources that Africa has in terms of mineral resources. This is one key area where African governments and African economies can actually leverage on. I'm looking at the fact that we almost have all that is needed by the developed world. And if we just leverage that in terms of having good deals on behalf of the government.
But about the developed countries, we're mainly referring to the Western countries, right? Coming and tapping into the opportunities, which is obviously the mineral resources, the raw materials that they want. Are they not also adding to this poverty in Africa? Because as they are taking the raw materials, is that taking the mineral resources, what exactly are they giving back to the African countries?
Well, we can't really blame the Western economies for doing what they know best. When you're a government, you do what's best for your people. When you have an economy, you actually get resources from wherever you can get to actually build your resources that you have, right? And then when you look at the fact that we have African governments who are supposed to be negotiating on the table to the better of their people, particularly the most problem that we have is poverty. It's actually a scourge. What are they supposed to do? They are supposed to actually do better. And we have seen some few examples of African countries that have done better. Like, for example, we mentioned Rwanda. They're actually doing good because the deals that they are bringing to the country, they're actually better from the same business partners that every other African country has. The Chinese are doing better in Rwanda and Kenya than they are doing elsewhere in the African continent. You also have got Botswana nearby. They're actually doing better because the deals that they have negotiated for, they are good deals. So I think that's number one. We are talking of the mineral resources. Then we are talking of the labor. The labor that we have is actually fleeing to the Western countries because they are not being utilized in their own countries. It's something that the African government can actually look into. Not just, develop skills that are going to...
And then it becomes cheap labor when it goes elsewhere.
You understand? That capital flight in terms of labor is something that we are supposed to actually stop. We're supposed to actually stem it as off now. And then you also look at... the land that we have, we still have got quite a lot of land that we can actually utilize in terms of if you want to establish industries, it's easier for you to actually do so. If you want to do farming on a large scale, it's actually easier for us to do so. And then you also look at the continent on its own. Like somebody was actually giving his opinion about how Africa could actually have stable electricity from one part, which is DRC. And the project has never been completed as a result of, bad governments, obviously. They don't.
Now, many African governments have adopted a number of normative frameworks that enshrine the values of accountability and democratic governance, which we actually touched on a little bit earlier on. Yet there seems to be an implementation deficit. It's almost what you're saying now, a gap regarding these norms in many of these African countries. So how does the government now bridge the gap? You've just pointed out the facts that they're lagging on. So how do we change that? What are then the solutions? Well, we have the old type of leadership that still is stuck on their old way of leading and doing things by the book. The old book, that is. But this is the new world. This is the 21st century. Technology, innovation has taken over. Then how do we bridge the gap?
The solution, I don't think it lies within the government, because the governments that we would want to fall back on are the same guys who are not actually offering anything, and they are not actually ready to secede power to anybody. I think the solution lies in active citizenry, because you see, this is one thing that the African governments have been very good at. They stem active citizenry at every stage. You look at student movements, the student bodies, they try to always make...
You think young leadership might also,
obviously,
add on to
young leadership
change?
would actually add on to change, because they have a different kind of thing. And for every generation, right, the next generation is better than the previous one. The way this generation is thinking, with them being exposed to technology, them being exposed to information, and them being exposed to a world that is actually very much open, you will find out they have solutions. The only problem that we have is, if we wait for the governments, you might actually not realize it. And this has been the case elsewhere, the old governments have been taken. Like, we're looking at cases where the governments which are more communist inclined, they were actually taken out by, groups of students who were doing active citizenship within the universities, their communities. So I think that's number one. And then number two, we can also rely on your non-governmental organizations. They need to actually be on the ground. Because you see, our problem stems from the fact that the old governments we don't want. The old leaders we don't want. They have a strong patronage system. The network is very strong, such that for you to dislodge them, you need to actually start on the grassroots. For example, for you to decide you want to do away with political movement that came as a result of being a guerrilla movement, they were on the ground. They were talking to the people. Just a little fear, or just one information passed on the ground, we are bringing back war. It will actually cause everybody
The NGOs that you're referring to, what kind of NGOs are they that will support this kind of change?
Well, NGOs, we are talking of mainly the NGOs in Africa are mainly formed of Christian bodies. They're formed of religious bodies, you see. So you can't actually ascribe them to the third force, which you hear from the media, where they say it's the third force trying to effect regime change and stuff. It's actually a conspiracy theory that is actually given by the governments because they don't want to go. But the truth of the matter is we know the NGOs. When you look at examples, for example, your Red Cross, when you look at, for example, your Care International, they have been on the ground helping people where the government has not been able to help. You understand? Those ones are the people who can actually bring change because they can inform the older generation of what they can receive by good governance, if they ask for accountability from the government, or by having young leaders come to the fore. So I think we need to play more on the side of active citizenry, because most of the people that live in the African continent, if you ask them about their constitution, they don't know about it. If you ask them about their laws, they can interpret them very well.
Ignorance perhaps plays a role. But then you see the point that you raise here.
Not just ignorance. It's actually something that is played for by the government. It's machinated ignorance. You understand?
Okay. But the point you raise here about NGOs playing a role in terms of trying to change the situation on the ground can be debated. It is the same NGOs that have also been accused of being culprits in terms of taking advantage of the poor and taking away from the poor in a way that seems as if they're actually giving back. Talking about that, the situation in countries that have been affected by threats, which leads me to my next point. The African continent has seen a rise in the threat of extremist groups. A good example, Boko Haram in Nigeria and in Cameroon and Al-Shabaab in East Africa. How can Africa address and mitigate the growth of radicalism and to appeal to young men in particular to address the root of these problems, such as the bad governance and poverty that then lead to all these things? Boko Haram, I've personally been to Nigeria, walked in the streets of where Boko Haram is rife in the northern part of Nigeria. Most of these are young people that are street urchins, no jobs, nothing to do. And then I'm just going to hold your thought, please. Just hold it there. We're going to take a quick break before we actually delve into this question and see how best we can answer this. Viewers, stay with us. We'll continue. Right now, we'll just take a short break. Okay, thank you for staying with us. We're back again and we continue with Poverty is Oppression with Dr. Progress Palm Springs. Now, before we went on a break, we spoke about one issue that has really affected, sadly, many African countries and citizens, innocent citizens, the issue of extremist threats. We were talking about Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, and all sorts of groups that are just mushrooming up. All caused by poverty. I was telling you that I was in Nigeria and I got to speak to them one-on-one. Street urchins, young boys, and even young girls. It has even gone further as to now they're even taking younger children, minors, and planting bombs on them and setting them into public places. What is that? What is the meaning of that? Can that ever be ended?
Okay, let me start with your last question. Can that ever be ended? I strongly believe so. Well, said as it is...
How?
When people are playing politics off the stomach and they are disenfranchising their own constituencies, you are bound to have something like this. For example, when you look at Nigeria, the juxtaposition of the North and the South in terms of the resources that are made available by the government as a federal system to the North and the South, you definitely end up with something like Boko Haram. And when you look at it, the actions that you are referring to, they have been denied of education, they have been denied of good healthcare, they have been denied of opportunities.
They've been denied of everything.
You understand? And then it's easier for them to join anybody who says, okay, hey, I can give you a small amount of money and you can do this, just do this for me. And this is world over, this is how the terrorist groups thrive. They thrive on the basis of, having somewhere to go and recruit people. So what can the government do? The government can actually stop the recruitment. They are supposed to do away with the recruitment grounds. Mm-hmm. How? It starts from oppression, because remember, there are different levels of oppressions. There is economic oppression, there is political oppression, and then all this, and you get into your social, like for example, your sexual oppression, where certain groups of people, they are seen as less in terms of, based on the sexual orientation and stuff. All these things, they actually play into what will end up as being terror groups within the community. Mm-hmm. You understand? And we have seen with the example, for example, the Niger Delta Avengers, they have not actually mushroomed into a proper terror group, because the government would sometimes go and negotiate with them, give them what they want. You understand? So if the government was going to address that, you find out that there won't be a lot of terror groups mushroom up in there, because the reason why they mushroom is because somebody is offering what is not being offered by the government. You understand? You look at the accountability that they give on the south. We are still talking about Nigeria, right? As compared to the north. Then you go to Al-Shabaab, it's still the same thing again. Mm-hmm. Some people, certain groups of people are disenfranchised. And it's mainly because in Africa, we have played this politics of tribalism for a long time.
For a long time.
And we have not managed to actually do away, or we don't have the political willingness to say, okay, let's do away with this tribal politics. Hence, we find out we are in this problem. Why is it when you look at countries that are doing well, for example, Rwanda, they no longer have any terror groups that are coming up.
They don't even have a situation where you now say, I'm a Hutu or a Tutsi.
Yes.
You now say you're a Rwandese.
So we can learn from that it's easy for you to do away with personal differences when you actually do according to the functions that you are given in terms of government, in terms of economics. Because see, the main two things that are at play here is either your governance in terms of politics, and then your economies in terms of how much resources are you availing to the people, either through the public sector or through the private sector. And we have seen the private-public partnerships that have been done by other countries, which have actually caused your terror groups to get away. You look at Botswana. We used to have a lot of your armed movements which were operating from Botswana. They have ceased to exist. Why? Because the main reason which causes people to be in terror groups, particularly in Africa, is as a result of them being denied of something, particularly their livelihood.
Okay. Now, still in Nigeria. Nigeria is one of the most populous countries in Africa. We all know that. And it's now surpassed South Africa as Africa's largest economy. Yet it still seems like there's a large degree of extreme poverty there. How does income inequality play into extreme poverty?
Well, when you look at it, I think that measurement, the measurement where they say Nigeria has become the biggest economy, after South Africa, or sometimes they say South Africa, then Nigeria second. It has got a flaw. Why? Because when you're talking of you becoming the biggest economy, you're not measuring just how much you have produced in terms of GDP, because GDP is just the quantity of goods and services that you have sold in terms of monetary value. Mm-hmm. You also need to factor in the population, because demographics not allow you to say you have a high GDP and then you have everybody else excluded from access to that monetary value. Mm-hmm. For example, that's why you find out there is that income inequality, which is in high margins, mainly because the economy is centralized in certain places. Mm-hmm. And then those certain places are doing very, very well, exceedingly well, to the extent that when we measure as a country, we say, okay, the country is doing great. But the real measure on the ground is supposed to be out of what the goods and services that we have produced, how much access we've brought to the people. Mm-hmm. And then you have to factor in the population, divide by the population, and find out averagely how much does a person have to spend in a day, in a month, mm-hmm. in a year. So I don't think it's a very good measure. And as a result, you find out we still have so many challenges which are coming, because some people are going to be oppressed somewhere. Why? We are using a very far-fetched measure which will only reflect in papers, mm-hmm. but is not reflecting on the ground. I would have wanted them to actually adopt something that has been adopted by countries like your Sweden and stuff, where the economy is brought closer to the people. Okay. You understand? For example, if you were to go to Nigeria, the Delta State is supposed to have enough for them to cater for the Delta people based on their population. So the budget allocation is supposed to be done on that. It's not supposed to be done on the basis of, okay, as a country, we have so much money. And then we decide, okay, we are putting this maybe to ammunition, we are putting this to security, we are putting this to infrastructure development. Why? Because if you do that, you will find out that certain places are excluded, and then inequality will continue to exist.
That's right.
Again, so in this regard, I think Africa should do away with that GDP measure and say, okay, we have a bigger economy. Bigger in what sense? Is it serving the people? Because you see, we have smaller countries which have bigger economies in terms of the amount of money that a person can spend, or the amount of purchasing power that is in the economy for a single person, is more than what we have in a country with a high GDP. So we shouldn't look so much into that.
Okay, well, on that note, we are going to just take a look at a clip of the Nigerian economy, all the Boko Haram attacks, the way the ordinary citizen is living on the streets. There were recently, protests of how fuel prices have been escalating, fluctuating every now and again, so people took to the streets. We'll have a look at that clip. Let's see.
Nigeria is Africa's economic powerhouse, and yet persistent corruption has continued to drag many of its citizens into poverty. Vice President Professor Yemi Osibanjo earlier this year acknowledged this challenge, saying that the problem of Nigeria for years has been poor leadership and bad governance. Nigeria's National Bureau of Statistics Poverty Report, published earlier this year in June, indicates that above 65% of the total population of the country lives in poverty. The country has the largest reserves of oil on the African continent, yet instead of benefiting from this precious resource, continued fighting in the oil-rich Niger Delta has resulted in loss of much-needed revenue.
Well, what corruption has done is the money meant for public services are now used by individuals for private services. And therefore, you certainly see reactions from the Nigerian community. So the government needs to address that. It's right you raised it. They need to address it in a manner in which impunity, because there's also impunity in corruption, where people just go to the till and take money and put it in their pocket. The reason that happens is because there's no punishment for corruption.
Corruption in the high echelons of power has resulted in unprecedented looting of the national coffers, which in turn has affected service delivery in the country.
Corruption is the kind of fabric that has eaten deep into the Nigerian body. But I think with time, Nigeria will change. With time.
Oil is the biggest contributor to Nigeria's GDP, but since fighting between government forces and rebels began several years ago, production has since gone down, which has left the government incapacitated to deliver basic services to its citizens.
So that's Nigeria in a nutshell. We couldn't really cover everything, but you can actually see the inequalities amongst the citizens of Nigeria. Very common. Even if you go to Zimbabwe, is also another country that you can make an example of the inequality of life. People are living there. But which sub-Saharan African countries are doing particularly well at reducing extreme poverty? I know you've mentioned a few, but what sub-Saharan African countries have performed in a way that perhaps they've become trailblazers and others can emulate?
Well,
they have been doing?
There are only a few. In fact, maybe I'll just say three. Kenya is trying. Like you see, their investment as far as infrastructure is concerned is something that is going to benefit them in the future, and it's going to do very greatly for the people, because it's something that the government is actually working on the ground for. And then you look at Rwanda. Rwanda, they've actually surpassed almost any other country from the Eastern Bloc in the Eastern Africa.
I think what really stands out about Rwanda is that from genocide, who would have thought from a country that suffered genocide for years on end?
And also economics-wise, you look at the economy is very strong. They have actually built into the fundamentals that make a very strong economy. And then, as I mentioned earlier, Botswana is also one country that is actually doing well. They're trying by all means possible. Of course, it's not going to be easy for them. We don't expect this to be the fruit that will actually come out maybe in 10 years or 20 years. Maybe at most 50. But you see, they have tried by all means possible, because when you look at them, and these are the factors that I think anybody should look into when you want to see whether the government is willing to change the plight of the people as far as poverty is concerned. You look at their budget in terms of healthcare, because you need a strong workforce. You need strong students who are going to actually participate very well for them to actually build into their future. You also need to also look into education. How much are they investing into, for example, skills or your universities? And then you also need to look into how much are they actually saving in terms of the process that they're getting maybe from the natural resources, because they get depleted at some time. Then you also need to look into the infrastructure that they bring. And then lastly, you also need to look into how much they're attracting foreign direct investment and local investment. So those countries have actually surpassed almost every other African country in trying to ensure that those 5 factors are met, and it's doing good for them.
Let's take a look at a country like Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, a country that used to have one of the strongest economies ever. Even the strongest currency is stronger than the pound and stronger than the United States. You would find the most educated people from Zimbabwe. They have good education systems and the economy performing very well for years. And now you look at Zimbabwe, it doesn't even have any healthcare systems that you can make comparison to or even, make reference to. You look at the economy completely at a standstill. Foreign investors are hesitant to go into the country, but you look at this country, this is not the first country that has come up and said that they want a 51% and 49% towards, a foreign direct investment. They're not the first ones. The Chinese do that.
Well,
but why have they particularly suffered the way they have suffered now? What could have been the causes?
Allow me to say this. They say they had a very strong economy. Not very strong, very strong agro-based economy. Something which was actually wrong in the first place. Why? Because your agro-produce, when you take it on the market, is affected by what happens in the commodities market. And it's not a very good thing for you to actually go with on the negotiating table. Why do we have the problems that we have? The reason why the healthcare is crumpled and the industries and whatever is because our industries are actually largely dependent on other industry, particularly in other countries. When you look at Zimbabwe, remember Zimbabwe used to be part of the federation together with South Africa, Zambia, and Malawi. And then they didn't break off from that. You find out administration was in Bulawayo, you understand? And then the industries, people were doing heavy industry would actually find their way into South Africa, into the mining industry and stuff. And then the people who were actually doing your fisheries and also a bit of agro-based in Malawi. And then Zambia also a bit of mining. That thing was supposed to actually have been broken when they moved away from the federation. They never changed those fundamentals. And remember, the problem of African governments, as I said, is because we lack ideas. And somebody gets into office, they're running with the constitution, they're running with books, they're running with laws, they're running with bills that have been there for I don't know, donkey years. And then they don't tailor them to the needs that are there in the country. Like, for example, you look at how we have a problem right now in Zimbabwe. We have a problem with issues of crowd control because the crowd control laws that we have were meant for the colonialists and stuff. That's why you find out they are very repressive and stuff. And that's another thing that also brings poverty again. Because we are saying the whites brought a certain level of poverty. We want to do away with that. Let's create something that is good for us as the African people. So I think when you look at it from that regard, it's not a very good situation for us because we need to start from there. And then also now you look at the fact that the way they went on negotiating the deals. Botswana was a British protectorate. When they were done with being a British protectorate, they went on the negotiating table with somebody who was a lawyer. Seth Seretekam was a good guy. And then he negotiated very well for the people. Our negotiators are not very good. At time will not allow us to get into some
Details.
of the individuals who have actually negotiated deals for example, the asbestos mines that we have. You'll find out that they didn't negotiate very well. And the reason why your investors would tend to actually have a scary fit and they are dreading to actually get into an agreement is because of your history.
Okay. We'll hold it there because we're going into another short break and we will continue looking and analyzing at the situation. Viewers, stay with us. We'll be back soon. Well, you're still watching Poverty is Oppression right here on ITV, and thank you for staying with us as we continue to analyze what poverty is and what bad governance is. You were just talking about Zimbabwe here before, we took an outbreak. Did you want to continue with that?
Well, I was just going to throw in the example of South Africa because when you look at the Zimbabwean economy, you look at South African economy and Botswana and also Namibia, you will find out that they are just small things that these 3 government or 4 governments have actually put in play to actually help themselves. You look at that deal, the 49-51 percentage deal that they wanted to do, they could have actually managed to do that. But now you need credibility for that. And the reason why we couldn't actually do it without scaring investors away is because our credibility in terms of our negotiators, government negotiators, was actually flawed. You look at Botswana, they did it. There's a 50-50 private-public partnership that is there. And DBS has agreed. DBS in South Africa is refusing for just 30% from, I think, 25. They are refusing to go there because of the credibility of the South African government. So when it comes to how much you're going to get out of that, you also need leaders who are credible. You understand? Because remember, the GDP that we will be talking about, or the GDP that we're clamoring for to actually help us in alleviating poverty, is a function of one of the factors, which is investment out of your consumption, your government, and then your exports, less imports. So if you are not able to actually bring in your investors without scaring them away, because they are concerned, stability is something that can do away. It can cause the capital flight in the country. You know, they're concerned also, the political squabbles, they are also going to eat away into their profits. And usually they will not want, nobody would want to invest in such a deal.
Absolutely not. Okay, so why is it important to eliminate poverty and reduce inequality in Africa? We've spoken about the causes of poverty. We've looked at the factors and how people have been living in such dire poverty and, you know, extreme circumstances. So why is it important that people are given a better life?
It is actually very, 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 very important, particularly for the African continent, because poverty is the root of all the problems that we have. Look at all the
poverty is a sin.
Yeah, it is. It is actually so, because you look at, you know, the lives that have been lost unnecessarily there as a result of poverty. You look at, you know, people who have died as a result of not them having medical supplies that they could have actually gotten. The corruption, the greed, the wars, the destruction of infrastructure and all that. You know, destruction even of the ecosystem it's actually as a result of poverty. Because if you were not poor in that regard, you would have found out that, because remember, poverty is not necessarily the signs that we see when we say, okay, this country is poor or has got poverty. It starts from the mind. It starts from the ideas that are implemented from the leadership, you understand, to the business society, and then you get to the civil society, and then you get to your students where they join in, and then you get to your normal small families where you're living, and then you can't provide food on the table, or you can't provide school fees for your children, or a good accommodation for them, transport, and all this. This would have actually been addressed if we actually put all our efforts, concerted effort on eradicating poverty. As governments, as the business community, as, you know, the students, you know, with young minds who can actually make inventions that can actually bring a lot of money to their own country. You understand? As the civil society, educating the people to actually hold their leaders in accountability, and, you know, to know certain things that will actually help you. For example, if our people knew, you know, about their constitution and they knew about their rights, they would be able to actually be able to bring maybe a member of parliament and say, you are bringing these guys, yes, they're going to be digging our society. How are we going to benefit? And, you know,
talk about it
for something that we also...
So what role does China actually play in the development of African countries? China seems to be in many places. We know their economy is booming, very competitive market, you know, for different types of business. But of what importance is China, and what role does it actually play in uplifting Africa? Okay,
let me first of all start by saying I'm not one for conspiracy theories. I know there's been talk in the media of how China is also the new player in the new type of colonialism. I don't necessarily think so. I think it's just a new player in terms of the economic ground that we have. Do you understand? They have actually done well for countries that they have actually been taken to task, you know, where we have good legislators who have said, okay, we want you to enter into this deal like this. You look like, for example, the example that we're given, the Kenya Railways was actually constructed by the Chinese guys. You look at Angola. Angola is booming as a result of what the Chinese guys are doing infrastructure-wise. Remember, these are the guys that actually popularized the building using bamboo.
But it's also the same Chinese that are also killing some economies by bringing in the most cheapest of products into the countries, adding on to the poverty that is already existent in those countries.
Hence I said I'm not for conspiracy theories. That one is a function of your own government, your own people. Why? Because the Chinese don't have all bad products. They don't have all good products. They have a mix of both. And then they present based on the economic value that you want to bring on the table. For example, I was giving you an example. Botswana, we have Chinese, the same Chinese people. They are doing great. They are building malls. They are having like best industries in terms of clothing and textiles. Why are they not doing the same in certain countries? Because the value that is being brought by some of the African governments, they don't really care whether they're going to help their own people. They're only caring about, okay, what can you get from it as the leaders of the country? So I think it's a function of your own government. Why? Because the differences that are there, they will not be there because China is one country, it's homogeneous. You know, the people cannot just all of a sudden get in one country and then they're different. So I think that should be blamed on their own people. Probably they can't bring their own leaders to account for certain things, or they have bad leaders who cannot negotiate better deals for them. Because you remember, it's the world that you are living in, as I said, it's a function of politics and government. It's one village where you are supposed to actually get there knowing that, okay, whatever you are doing is going to affect your people, it's also going to affect their people.
That's it. So what are the African countries that we should be paying close attention to going forward in this 21st century?
I would say from the Sahel region, you should pay attention to your Tunisia. They seem to be doing quite well. And then from the Eastern Africa, I think you should be looking for Ethiopia, you should be looking for Kenya, you should be looking for Rwanda, maybe Uganda if they have a change in terms of politics. Southern Africa, they should look out for Botswana, they should look out for Namibia, they seem to be quite doing well. And
Malawi, Zambia, still
Malawi, Zambia,
lagging behind?
We just give them 10 years, we can be looking out for them, because right now they are still recovering from the damage done.
Absolutely. And Zimbabwe, any hopes of them changing soon, upgrading soon?
Well, I would only say so if we have a change in leadership.
Okay.
If we have a change in leadership, you should accept in a period of 5 to 10 years, I would have recuperated and would be back on track, competing with everybody else.
Oh, wonderful. And now, just, in closing, just to trace it back a little, at what point did it become so important for people to leave villages and go to cities? The migration and the movement going up and down, and now even expatiated to not even urban cities, rural areas to urban cities, but even to other countries. Was there a turning point, or did it just happen because work seemed to be available in those particular areas? I'm just taking you a little, we had this conversation in the beginning, but I'm just taking you a little back.
Well, that's the narrative that you hear from, historical pages, articles that, okay, people were moving for work and stuff. But I would put it as innovation is the one that caused people to start moving from the rural to the urban, mainly because the urban was a place where you could actually innovate and get paid for it, rewarded very well in economic sense. Like you find out, there are certain countries where people are actually migrating from the town to the rural because there's no difference. Electricity is being offered, clean water, they have good roads and stuff, and they're not worrying about anything. They're not worrying about, okay, I need to move to this place for this kind of benefit. It's just a matter of reward. And it's economic interplay. You have the demand, I supply. You understand? And then you are rewarded well by the interplay of the two. You look at, for example, the Scandinavian countries. The bulk of them they are rural. But they have people who are actually doing the industries which are actually being run from the rural.
From the rural areas.
There's no problem. So I don't think it's as a result of, okay, you need to go there, a place. It's as a result of the innovation that the place can offer.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Progress Palm Springs, for that analysis on poor governance and poverty affecting people in Africa. And to our viewers, obviously, I'm sure you would concur that everyone aspires to attain financial prosperity and live comfortable in life. Who wouldn't want that? I do.
Yeah.
Obviously, many people do. And to realize these aspirations, it is crucial to seek out reasonable opportunities to pursue them. One cannot succeed without working towards a goal. A life of poverty means that an individual is not able to enjoy some of the good things in life. It is therefore important to eliminate poverty. Well, to all our viewers, thank you for joining us this evening. That's all we have time for. And join us again next week as we continue with the conversation, Poverty is Oppression. Thank you for watching and good evening.